Barbara had always known she was adopted. It was not a secret, nor a source of shame or confusion in her life. Her parents, the ones who raised her, loved her, and shaped her into the woman she was, had always been open about it. They had told her the story of how they had chosen her, how they had waited for her, and how overjoyed they were when she finally came into their lives. It was a beautiful story, one that made her feel special and deeply loved. At 30 years old, Barbara had a life that many would envy. She had a loving husband, Mark, who still looked at her the same way he did when they first met in college. They had a son, Ethan, a precocious 5-year-old who filled their days with laughter and their nights with exhaustion. Their home was modest but comfortable, filled with the chaos and joy that comes with family life. Barbara had a fulfilling career as a graphic designer, working from home most days, which allowed her to be present for Ethan's milestones and everyday moments. Her relationship with her parents remained strong, with weekly dinners and frequent phone calls. She had friends, hobbies, and a sense of purpose. In short, she had everything she had ever wanted. That Tuesday afternoon had started like any other. Barbara had been working on a project, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she raced to meet a deadline. Ethan was at kindergarten, and Mark was at work. The house was quiet, save for the soft clicking of her mouse and the occasional hum of the refrigerator. The doorbell rang, breaking her concentration. Barbara glanced at the clock, frowning. It was too early for Ethan to be home, and she was not expecting any deliveries. For a moment, she considered ignoring it, but something, intuition perhaps, made her get up and answer the door. The woman standing on her porch was a stranger to Barbara, yet there was something eerily familiar about her features. She was in her early 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. She smiled nervously as Barbara opened the door, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her purse. The woman introduced herself as Clara and revealed that she was Barbara's biological mother. Barbara was stunned, gripping the doorframe as she felt lightheaded. 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind. She had never sought out her biological parents, never felt the need to. Yet here was this woman, claiming to be the one who had given birth to her, standing on her doorstep on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Barbara stared at Clara, taking in the features that she now realized mirrored her own. The resemblance was undeniable, and it shook her to her core. She did not know what to say or feel. Should she be angry that Clara had disrupted her peaceful life? Should she be curious about the circumstances that led to her adoption? Should she be grateful for the chance to fill in the blanks of her biological history? All Barbara knew was that in that moment, she felt completely and utterly lost. Clara stood there, waiting patiently for Barbara's response, but Barbara had no response to give. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion and conflicting emotions. The life she had known, the identity she had built for herself, suddenly felt fragile and uncertain. As she stood there, frozen in the doorway, Barbara realized that whether she wanted it or not, her life had just taken an unexpected turn, and she had no idea where this new path would lead her. Barbara had spent the rest of that Tuesday in a daze. After Clara left, having given her contact information and a plea to think about meeting again, Barbara had wandered through the house like a ghost. When Mark came home with Ethan, she had managed to put on a facade of normalcy, but inside she was churning. That night, after they had put Ethan to bed, Barbara told Mark about Clara's visit. She watched his face as she spoke, seeing the surprise, concern, and then understanding flicker across his features. He had listened quietly, his hand holding hers, offering silent support. Mark asked what Barbara wanted to do, but she had no answer for him. The truth was, she did not know what she wanted. The next day, Barbara called her mother, Maria. Her reaction was much like Mark's, surprise, followed by immediate concern for Barbara's well-being. Maria had insisted on coming over, and soon they were sitting at Barbara's kitchen table, mugs of untouched coffee growing cold between them. As Barbara spoke to her mother, memories of her childhood flooded back. She remembered the countless bedtime stories, the band-aids on scraped knees, the proud smiles at school events. She recalled the day they told her she was adopted, emphasizing how special she was, how they had chosen her. Barbara had never felt unloved or unwanted. One memory stood out vividly. Barbara was 7, and a classmate had made a cruel comment about adopted children not being real children. She had come home in tears. Her mother had held her close, wiping her tears away and telling her that being a parent was not about blood, but about love. Those words had comforted Barbara then, and they comforted her now as she sat across from her mother, grappling with this new reality. Barbara asked her mother what she should do, feeling like a lost child again. Maria's eyes were filled with understanding and love as she told Barbara that it was a decision only she could make, and that she and Barbara's father would support her no matter what she chose. Her mother's unconditional support, while comforting, also intensified Barbara's internal conflict. Part of her was curious about Clara, about the family she had never known. She wondered about her biological father, about potential siblings. Did she have aunts, uncles, grandparents out there? What was her medical history? These were questions Barbara had never seriously considered before, but now they loomed large in her mind. Yet another part of Barbara recoiled at the idea of letting these strangers into her life. She had a family, a wonderful, loving family. She had parents who had chosen her, who had been there for every important moment of her life. She had a husband who loved her, a son who was her world. Did she really need more than that? The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions for Barbara. She found herself scrutinizing her reflection in the mirror, searching for traces of Clara in her features. She caught herself wondering if her artistic talents came from Clara, or if her tendency to bite her nails when stressed was a shared trait. At night, Barbara lay awake, her mind racing. What if she met Clara and did not like her? What if she did like her? What would that mean for her relationship with her parents? Would getting to know her biological family somehow diminish the family she had known and loved all her life? Barbara knew she had to make a decision. Clara's contact information sat on her desk, a constant reminder of the choice that lay before her. But every time she reached for the phone, she hesitated. The weight of the decision felt overwhelming. As she stood at this crossroads, Barbara realized that whatever choice she made would irrevocably change her life. The comfortable certainty she had always felt about her identity and her place in the world had been shaken. Now, she had to decide whether to embrace this new aspect of her history or to close the door on it. The path forward was unclear, shrouded in a fog of uncertainty and conflicting emotions. But one thing was certain: the decision Barbara was about to make would shape not just her future, but the future of all those she loved. And that knowledge filled her with both fear and a strange sense of anticipation. A week had passed since Clara's unexpected visit, and Barbara had been living in a state of emotional limbo. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on her mind, coloring every moment of her days. It was during a quiet afternoon, while Ethan was at a play date, that her mother, Maria, called. Maria's voice carried a note of concern as she asked how Barbara was doing. Barbara had tried to deflect, to assure her that everything was fine, but Maria knew her too well. Before Barbara knew it, she was pouring out all her fears and doubts, her voice cracking with emotion. Barbara admitted that she was scared. She wondered aloud, what if meeting Clara changed everything? What if she liked her? What if she did not? She expressed her fear of hurting her parents. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Barbara feared she had said too much. But when Maria spoke, her voice was filled with warmth and understanding. She reassured Barbara that she and Barbara's father had loved her from the moment they first held her, and that nothing could ever change that. Maria acknowledged that it was natural for Barbara to be curious about her biological family, and that this curiosity did not diminish their relationship. Maria continued, telling Barbara that they wanted her to be happy. She said that if meeting Clara would bring Barbara peace or answers, then she should do it. And if she decided not to, that was okay too. Maria assured Barbara that they would support her either way, emphasizing that Barbara was their daughter and they loved her unconditionally. By the time they ended the call, Barbara's cheeks were wet with tears, but she felt lighter than she had in days. Her mother's unconditional support had given her the courage to make a decision. The next morning, Barbara found herself dialing Clara's number. Her heart raced as the phone rang, and she almost hung up twice before Clara answered. They agreed to meet at a small cafe in the neutral territory of the city center. As Barbara drove to the cafe, she tried to steel herself emotionally. She had decided to approach this meeting with a detached curiosity.
Hi, Mrs. Touching Stories here. Enjoying the story? Subscribe now, like, and comment to catch all the upcoming emotions.
She would listen to what Clara had to say, but she would not allow herself to get emotionally invested. This was just a conversation, Barbara told herself. Nothing more. The cafe was busy when Barbara arrived, the hum of conversations and the aroma of coffee filling the air. She spotted Clara immediately, sitting at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a mug. Clara looked up as Barbara approached, and Barbara saw a mix of hope and nervousness in her eyes. Clara greeted Barbara, thanking her for agreeing to meet. Barbara nodded, sitting down across from her. Up close, the resemblance between them was even more striking, and Barbara found herself studying Clara's features, searching for similarities and differences. An awkward silence fell between them. Barbara did not know where to begin, what to ask. The questions she had rehearsed in her mind seemed to evaporate in the face of this real flesh and blood woman who was her biological mother. Clara broke the silence first, acknowledging that this must be overwhelming for Barbara. She admitted that she had thought about this moment for 30 years, and now that it was here, she hardly knew what to say. Barbara nodded, her throat tight. She asked Clara why she had decided to find her after all this time. Clara's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment Barbara felt a flicker of empathy. But she quickly suppressed it, reminding herself to maintain emotional distance. As Clara began to speak, telling Barbara about the circumstances of her birth and her decision to give her up for adoption, Barbara listened with a mixture of curiosity and detachment. She asked questions about her biological father, about potential siblings, about family medical history. Clara answered each question patiently, her eyes never leaving Barbara's face. Throughout the conversation, Barbara kept reminding herself that this woman was a stranger. She might be her biological mother, but she was not her mom. Barbara's mom was at home, probably worrying about how this meeting was going. Her mom was the one who had raised her, loved her, shaped her into the person she was today. As their meeting drew to a close, Barbara felt a confusing mix of emotions. Part of her was glad she had come, satisfied to have some answers to questions she had not even known she had. Another part of her felt overwhelmed, unsure of what to do with this new information. Clara asked if they could meet again, her voice hopeful. Barbara hesitated, then told her she would need time to process everything. Clara nodded, understanding in her eyes. As Barbara walked out of the cafe, she felt as if she had just taken a step into unknown territory. She had opened a door that could not be closed again. What lay beyond that door, she did not know. But as she drove home, to the family that had chosen her and loved her unconditionally, Barbara knew that whatever came next, she would face it with their support. In the weeks following her meeting with Clara, Barbara had tried to return to her normal routine. She immersed herself in work, spent extra time playing with Ethan, and made a point of calling her parents more often. She had told herself that the meeting with Clara had satisfied her curiosity, that she could now close that chapter and move on with her life. But Clara had not given up so easily. At first, it was just occasional text messages, brief, non-intrusive notes asking how Barbara was doing or sharing a thought she had about their meeting. Barbara had responded politely but briefly, maintaining the emotional distance she had set for herself. As the days turned into weeks, Clara's attempts at connection became more frequent. She sent Barbara old family photos, pointing out relatives who shared her features. She told Barbara stories about her pregnancy, about the hopes and dreams she had had for her. Each message chipped away at the wall Barbara built around her emotions. Barbara found herself resisting these attempts at connection, yet at the same time, she could not bring herself to ask Clara to stop. Despite her best efforts, she felt a growing curiosity about her biological family. Questions she had never considered before now plagued her thoughts. Did she have siblings? What were her grandparents like? Were there family traditions she had never known about? One afternoon, as Barbara was sorting through some old boxes in the attic, She came across her baby album. She had seen it many times before, but now she looked at it with new eyes. The first photo, taken just after her adoption, showed her parents beaming with joy as they held her. Their love was evident in every image that followed: her first steps, her first day of school, birthdays, and holidays. As she flipped through the pages, Barbara felt a deep sense of gratitude for the life they had given her. But for the first time, she also felt a pang of loss for the life she might have had. She wondered what her childhood would have been like if she had grown up with Clara. Would she have been a different person? These thoughts intensified the conflict that had been brewing inside Barbara since Clara's first visit. On one hand, she felt a deep loyalty to her adoptive family. They were the ones who had raised her, loved her, and shaped her into the person she was. The thought of potentially hurting them by pursuing a relationship with her biological family filled her with guilt. On the other hand, the pull of her biological roots was becoming harder to ignore. It was not just curiosity about her medical history or family traits anymore. It was a desire to understand a part of herself that she had never fully explored. Barbara found herself lying awake at night, torn between these conflicting desires. She wanted to honor the family that had chosen her, that had given her everything. But she also yearned to know more about where she came from, to fill in the blanks of her biological history. The conflict began to seep into Barbara's daily life. She caught herself studying Ethan's features, wondering if he looked more like her or like Clara. When her mother called, Barbara felt a twinge of guilt, as if she was somehow betraying her by even considering a relationship with Clara. One evening, as Barbara and Mark were getting ready for bed, he noticed her distraction. He gently asked if she was thinking about Clara again. Barbara nodded, unable to deny it. She admitted that she did not know what to do. She loved her family and did not want to hurt them, but she could not stop thinking about Clara and the family she never knew. Mark sat beside Barbara on the bed, taking her hand in his. He reassured her that her parents loved her and wanted her to be happy. He suggested that maybe it was time for Barbara to talk to them about how she was feeling. His words struck a chord. Barbara had been so focused on protecting her parents' feelings that she had not considered the possibility that they might understand her conflicted emotions. As she lay in bed that night, Barbara made a decision. She would talk to her parents about her feelings. She would be honest about her growing curiosity and her fears. It would not be an easy conversation, but she knew it was necessary. The path forward was still unclear, but Barbara felt a sense of resolve. Whatever came next, she would face it head-on, with honesty and openness. The conflict within her was far from resolved, but for the first time since Clara's appearance, Barbara felt like she was taking a step in the right direction. As the weeks passed, Clara's persistence began to wear down Barbara's defenses. Her messages, once a source of anxiety, became a regular part of Barbara's day. Clara shared stories of her life, of Barbara's biological father, and of the family Barbara had never known. Each tidbit of information was a small piece of a puzzle Barbara had not known she was missing. One day, Clara sent a photo that caught Barbara off guard. It was a picture of Clara holding a newborn, Barbara. The sight of it stirred something deep within Barbara. She found herself staring at it for hours, tracing the lines of Clara's face, so similar to her own. For the first time, Barbara allowed herself to imagine what life might have been like if circumstances had been different. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, Barbara began to respond to Clara's messages with more than just polite acknowledgments. She asked questions about the stories Clara shared, about the people in the photos. Each answer Clara gave only fueled Barbara's growing curiosity. It was a photo of a family gathering that finally broke Barbara's resolve. In it, she saw faces that mirrored her own, people who shared her blood. Among them were two young women who Clara identified as Barbara's biological sisters. Barbara had siblings. The realization hit her like a physical blow. That night, Barbara lay awake, her mind racing. She had always wondered what it would be like to have siblings. Now she had two sisters she had never met. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. The next morning, Barbara made a decision that she knew would change everything. She called Clara and agreed to meet her family. The day of the meeting arrived all too quickly. Barbara stood outside the restaurant where they had agreed to meet, her heart pounding. Mark had offered to come with her, but she had decided this was something she needed to do alone. As Barbara entered, she saw them immediately. Clara was there, along with an older man Barbara assumed was her biological father. Next to them sat two women who could only be her sisters. They all stood as Barbara approached, their faces a mix of nervousness and excitement. Clara made the introductions. Barbara's biological father, Robert, shook her hand warmly. Her sisters, Sarah and Emily, both hugged her, their embraces awkward but heartfelt. As they sat down, an uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Barbara did not know what to say, how to act. These people were her family, yet they were strangers. It was Sarah who broke the ice. She joked about having about 30 years of sisterly bonding to catch up on. Her comment eased the tension, and soon they were all talking. They asked about Barbara's life, her family, her career. Barbara found herself sharing stories about Ethan, about her work, about the parents who had raised her. As the evening progressed, Barbara began to see glimpses of herself in these strangers. Sarah had her laugh. Emily gestured with her hands the same way Barbara did when she spoke. Robert had the same crinkle around his eyes when he smiled. They shared stories of their lives, of family traditions Barbara had never known. She learned that music ran in the family. Both Sarah and Emily were accomplished musicians. Barbara thought of her own love for music, wondering if it was more than just coincidence. As the night drew to a close, Barbara felt a mix of emotions she could not quite name. Part of her was exhilarated by this new connection, by the discovery of a whole branch of her family tree she had never known existed. Another part of her felt guilty, as if she was somehow betraying the family that had raised her. Clara hugged Barbara as they said goodbye, her eyes shining with tears. She thanked Barbara for giving them a chance. Barbara nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. As she walked to her car, her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. She had taken a step into a new world, one that was both familiar and utterly foreign. On the drive home, Barbara found herself wondering what this would mean for her relationship with her adoptive family. How would she balance these two parts of her life? Could she integrate this new family into her existing one, or would she always feel torn between the two? As Barbara pulled into her driveway, she saw the warm glow of lights from her house. Inside were the people who had chosen her, who had loved her unconditionally for 30 years. She sat in her car for a long moment, gathering her thoughts. Barbara had opened a door that could not be closed. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with potential joy and potential heartache. But as she walked towards her home, towards the family that had always been there for her, Barbara knew one thing for certain. This journey, wherever it led, would change her in ways she could not yet imagine. In the months that followed Barbara's first meeting with her biological family, she found herself drawn deeper into their world. What had started as cautious curiosity had evolved into a genuine desire to know them, to understand the life she might have had. Barbara began to spend more time with Clara, Robert, Sarah, and Emily. They met for coffee, shared meals, and even attended a few family gatherings. Each interaction revealed new facets of Barbara's biological heritage. She discovered that Sarah and she shared a love for abstract art, while Emily and she had the same dry sense of humor. Robert, it turned out, had the same habit of humming while he worked that Barbara did. As Barbara delved deeper into this newfound family, she felt a growing sense of connection. It was as if pieces of a puzzle she had not known was incomplete were slowly falling into place.
Hi, Mrs. Touching Stories here. Enjoying the story? Subscribe now, like, and comment to catch all the upcoming emotions.
She began to see echoes of herself in their mannerisms, their likes and dislikes, even in the way they laughed. However, this growing connection came at a price. The more time Barbara spent with her biological family, the more she felt a subtle tension creeping into her relationship with her adoptive family. It was nothing overt. Her parents, Maria and John, were as loving and supportive as ever. But Barbara could see the flicker of hurt in her mother's eyes when she mentioned spending time with Clara. She noticed the slight stiffness in her father's shoulders when she talked about Robert. Family gatherings, once a source of unalloyed joy, became fraught with unspoken tension. At Ethan's birthday party, Barbara caught her mother watching her with a mixture of love and sadness as she showed Clara photos on her phone. During their traditional Sunday dinners, Barbara found herself censoring her stories, carefully avoiding mentions of her biological family. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Barbara's father asked about her plans for the upcoming weekend. Barbara hesitated before admitting that she had plans to attend a concert with Sarah and Emily. The silence that followed was deafening. Her mother's smile was a little too bright, her father's nod a little too stiff. In that moment, Barbara felt like she was betraying the very people who had given her everything. As the weeks passed, Barbara found herself increasingly torn between these two worlds. She loved her adoptive family with all her heart, but she could not deny the pull of her biological roots. The more she learned about her birth family, the more questions she had about herself. Barbara began to examine every aspect of her personality, her likes and dislikes, her strengths and weaknesses. Was her love for music inherited from her biological family? Was her tendency to overthink things a trait she shared with Clara? She found herself questioning everything she had ever believed about her identity. Late one night, unable to sleep, Barbara stood in front of the mirror, studying her reflection. She saw Clara's eyes looking back at her, Robert's jawline, Sarah's smile. But she also saw the expressions she had inherited from Maria, the mannerisms she had picked up from John. Who was she really? Where did she truly belong? The question of nature versus nurture, once an abstract concept, had become intensely personal for Barbara. She was a product of two families, two histories, two sets of experiences. How could she reconcile these two parts of herself? Barbara thought about Ethan, peacefully asleep in his room. He was a blend of Mark and her, carrying forward genes from both their families. But he was also his own person, unique and individual. Barbara wondered if he would ever face the same questions about identity that now plagued her. As dawn broke, Barbara was no closer to answers. She realized that this journey of self-discovery was far from over. She had opened Pandora's box, and there was no going back. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with potential joy and potential pain. Barbara knew she had to find a way to balance her relationships with both families. She could not continue to compartmentalize these two parts of her life. But how could she integrate them without hurting anyone? How could she honor both the family that chose her and the family that gave her life? As Barbara watched the sun rise, casting new light on the familiar landscape of her backyard, she understood that she was standing at a crossroads. The choices she made in the coming days and weeks would shape not just her future, but the future of all those she loved. The weight of that responsibility was daunting, but she knew she had to face it head-on. With a deep breath, Barbara turned away from the window, ready to face a new day. She did not have all the answers, but she was determined to find a way forward. Her journey of self-discovery was far from over, but for the first time, she felt ready to embrace the complexity of her identity, whatever that might mean. It was a crisp autumn evening when the realization hit Barbara. She had just returned from a weekend trip with her biological family, a camping excursion that had been filled with laughter, shared stories, and a growing sense of belonging. As she walked through the front door of her home, she was struck by how foreign it felt. The familiar scents, the arrangement of furniture, even the sound of Mark's footsteps upstairs. It all seemed somehow distant, as if she was viewing her life through a veil. Barbara stood in the entryway, her bag still slung over her shoulder, as a wave of guilt washed over her. She had missed Ethan's soccer game for this trip. She had been absent for Sunday dinner with her parents, Maria and John, for the third time in a row. When was the last time she had called her best friend or had a proper date night with Mark? That night, after Ethan had gone to bed, Barbara found herself sitting at the kitchen table with Mark. The silence between them was heavy, laden with unspoken thoughts and concerns. Mark quietly told Barbara that he thought they needed to talk. His eyes met hers with a mixture of love and worry. Barbara nodded, feeling a lump form in her throat. She whispered that she knew. Mark reached across the table, taking Barbara's hand in his. He told her that he had watched her these past few months. He had seen how excited she was about getting to know her biological family, but he had also seen how torn she was, how conflicted. His words opened a floodgate. Suddenly, Barbara was pouring out all the thoughts and feelings she had been bottling up for months. She told him about the guilt she felt when she was with her biological family, the sense that she was betraying Maria and John. She confessed to the excitement she felt learning about her roots, but also the fear that she was losing sight of who she was. Barbara admitted, tears streaming down her face, that she did not know who she was anymore. She felt like she was being pulled in two directions, and she did not know how to reconcile them. Mark listened patiently, his thumb tracing soothing circles on the back of Barbara's hand. When she had finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Finally, Mark told Barbara that she was the same person she had always been. She was his wife, Ethan's mother, Maria and John's daughter. Learning about her biological family did not change that, but it was okay to want to know them, to explore that part of her history. His words were like a balm to Barbara's troubled soul, but they also forced her to confront a truth she had been avoiding. In her eagerness to know her biological family, she had been neglecting the family that had always been there for her. As if reading her thoughts, Mark continued, telling Barbara that she needed to find a balance. Her parents, Maria and John, they were hurting. They were afraid of losing her. His words hit Barbara like a physical blow. She had been so caught up in her own emotional journey that she had failed to see the pain she was causing those closest to her. That night, as Barbara lay awake in bed, she found herself thinking about all the moments that had shaped her life. She remembered the day Maria and John had told her she was adopted, emphasizing how special she was, how they had chosen her. She thought about all the birthdays, holidays, and ordinary days filled with love and laughter. Barbara thought about Clara, Robert, Sarah, and Emily. She was grateful for the opportunity to know them, to understand her roots. But as she lay there, she realized a fundamental truth that she had somehow lost sight of in recent months. Family is not just about blood. It is about love, about choice, about the people who stand by you through thick and thin. Barbara's true family was not determined by genetics alone, but by the bonds forged through years of shared experiences, of unconditional love and support. As dawn broke, Barbara made a decision. She would continue to get to know her biological family, but not at the expense of the family that had raised her, loved her, and shaped her into the person she was. She needed to find a balance, to integrate these two parts of her life without losing sight of what truly mattered. With this realization came a sense of peace Barbara had not felt in months. She knew the path forward would not be easy. There would be difficult conversations, hurt feelings to mend, and a delicate balance to maintain. But for the first time since Clara had appeared on her doorstep, Barbara felt like she knew who she was and where she belonged. As Barbara got up to start the day, she was filled with a sense of purpose. She had a lot of work to do, a lot of bridges to rebuild, but she was ready to face it, secure in the knowledge that her true family, the one that had chosen her, raised her, and loved her unconditionally, would be there to support her every step of the way. The crisp December air nipped at Barbara's cheeks as she stood outside the small cafe where she had agreed to meet Clara. Her heart raced, but she felt a sense of resolve that had been missing for months. It was time for honesty, for setting boundaries, for finding a balance that would allow her to honor all parts of her identity without sacrificing the relationships that meant the most to her. Clara arrived, her smile warm but tinged with uncertainty. They ordered coffee and found a quiet corner table. For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them.
Hi, Mrs. Touching Stories here. Enjoying the story? Subscribe now, like, and comment to catch all the upcoming emotions.
Barbara began, her voice steady despite her nerves, telling Clara that she needed to talk to her about something important. She saw a flicker of fear in Clara's eyes, but Clara nodded, encouraging her to continue. Barbara explained that these past few months had been complicated. Getting to know Clara, Robert, Sarah, and Emily had been incredible. She was grateful for the opportunity to understand her roots, to see parts of herself reflected in all of them. Clara's eyes softened, but Barbara pressed on before she could speak. Barbara told her that she had realized something crucial. In her eagerness to explore this new connection, she had been neglecting the family that had always been there for her, the family that chose her, raised her, and loved her unconditionally. Barbara saw the hurt in Clara's eyes, but she knew she had to be honest. She assured Clara that she wanted to continue getting to know her, but she needed to establish some boundaries. Her parents, Maria and John, they were her family. They always would be. Barbara could not and would not replace them. Clara was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. She told Barbara that she understood, that she never meant to come between Barbara and her family. She just wanted to know Barbara. They talked for hours, hashing out what their relationship would look like moving forward. It was not easy, and there were moments of tension and tears. But by the time they parted, they had reached an understanding. Clara and Barbara would continue to build a relationship, but at a pace that allowed Barbara to maintain balance in her life. The next day, Barbara drove to her parents' house, her heart heavy with the weight of the conversation she knew they needed to have. Maria opened the door, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. As they sat in the living room, surrounded by familiar photos and mementos of Barbara's childhood, she poured out everything she had been feeling. She told her mother about her curiosity, her confusion, her guilt. She spoke of the connection she felt with her biological family, but also of the unbreakable bond she shared with Maria and John. Barbara, her voice breaking, apologized if she had hurt them. She told her mother that she and her father were her parents. They always had been, they always would be. Nothing could change that. Maria's eyes filled with tears. She reached out, pulling Barbara into a fierce embrace. She whispered that they loved Barbara so much. They had just been afraid of losing her. They cried together, years of love and shared experiences flowing between them. When John came home and joined them, they talked for hours, reaffirming their bonds and healing the rifts that had formed. As Christmas approached, Barbara found herself filled with a sense of peace she had not felt in months. She had spoken with Clara, explaining that while she valued their growing relationship, her Christmas celebration would be with her family, Maria, John, Mark, and Ethan. But as Barbara helped her mother prepare for their traditional Christmas Eve dinner, an idea began to form. After a long discussion with her parents and Mark, they decided to extend an invitation to Clara to join them for dessert and coffee after their family dinner. Christmas Eve arrived, bringing with it the familiar sense of Barbara's mother's cooking and the sound of carols playing softly in the background. They ate, laughed, and exchanged gifts, the warmth of family love enveloping them all. As the evening wound down, the doorbell rang. Barbara answered it to find Clara standing there, a tentative smile on her face and a small gift in her hands. Clara softly wished her a Merry Christmas. Barbara led Clara into the living room, where her family waited. There was a moment of awkward silence, but then Barbara's father stood, offering Clara a warm handshake and a mug of hot cocoa. As they sat around the Christmas tree, Clara a polite but not intimate presence, Barbara looked around at the faces of those she loved most in the world. Maria and John, the parents who had chosen her and given her a lifetime of love. Mark, her partner and support through every challenge. Ethan, her son, the living embodiment of the family they had created together. And Clara, a connection to her past, a part of her story but not the whole of it. In that moment, Barbara felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. Her journey of self-discovery had been challenging, filled with ups and downs, but it had led her here, to a place of balance and acceptance. As the clock struck midnight, ushering in Christmas Day, Barbara realized that family was not about blood or genetics. It was about love, about choice, about the bonds we forge and the relationships we nurture. Barbara had found her balance. She had accepted all parts of herself, her past, her present, and her future. And surrounded by the love of her family, both chosen and biological, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she was ready to face them. The story of Barbara's identity was still being written, but now, finally, she was the one holding the pen.